This is Universal Lunch, Out of Office Uncommon Hours, a limited-run live-streamed web series on the occasion of Futurespective, an exhibition with events and happenings that demonstrate how design inquiry engages in open-ended, extra-disciplinary exchange. Futurespective runs through December 14th, this week, at the Institute of Contemporary Art at the Maine College of Art in Portland, Maine. I'm Jimmy Liu in Austin, Texas.
And I'm Gabrielle in Newark, New Jersey. Futurespective has been asking a simple question. What does it mean to rethink the past in the present to point to the future? And each Thursday for the duration of the exhibition since early in the fall, we've been gathering a diverse group of thinkers and makers to kick around answers to this question relative to design, to culture, and to anything else that our guests have wanted to discuss. It's the end of an era, Jimmy.
It is. We made it through all the episodes, and here we are at the end.
Yes, the Futurespective closes in 2 days. By all accounts, the first Friday, late hours of last week were a great success. I think they've had really good attendance at the exhibition. People, we've heard anecdotally, people have been visiting it once and then going back again and again to continue to uncover its riches, which I suppose is the same thing that we've been doing with Universal Lunch as we look back over the episodes, and hopefully our vast audience has been doing the same. The beauty of live stream turning into captured video.
Yes, and I think one can also say the same thing about design inquiry, that you come once and then you want to come back again and again to discover its many layered riches.
Yes, come for the topic, stay for the bread.
Yes, yes. What are your thoughts now that it's all going to have to come down? All of the work, all of the energy, the activities surrounding it now coming to a close. How do you feel as one of the curators of the exhibition?
Well, I think whenever there's the final chapter of something, it causes one to be reflective. And I think that one of the things that I've come to realize, of course, is that our original ambition for the exhibition was that in some ways the work that was on display was merely an index of the actual project of design inquiry. And I mean that project as both the project of this nonprofit educational organization, this design collective, as well as literally the project of inquiring after design. And so in some ways, I think it's perfectly fine that the exhibition is closing. One could argue that it's done its job, which was to demonstrate the possibility of inquiring after design across media, across kind of content, disciplines, and hopefully people meaning those who stumbled in off the street, those who came intentionally, those who were participating in some way, as a resident, as a guest on Universal Lunch, as a student at Mecca this semester, as a participant in the convivium, that anyone, or in the currency gathering, that anyone who somehow crossed paths with the Futurespective is having a kind of renewed engagement with the notion of design as an everyday practice.
And I think, that term "demonstrate" I think is pretty key to me as a viewer of the exhibition, is that it's not just like documenting and like showing you what has happened, but it's active in that way of demonstrating to a viewer, like, this is what it is. Like, you are experiencing it instead of just being a passive observer of dead documents.
And I think, also directly connected to that is the notion of unfinished, that everything up there is intentionally unfinished. Some of it unfinished in the sense that it's only capturing work in process, but also unfinished because for the experiential reasons that you just discussed, that the work that is on the walls, the work that is on the tables, the work that is in the reading room has continued to change over the course of the exhibition, deliberately and sometimes kind of accidentally because someone who showed up left something behind, and that then ends up getting registered as part of the exhibition. And I think that's one of the most exciting things about it. And also the way that the exhibition reflects what one could describe as the kind of larger methodology of design inquiry, which is to trust in that unknown and unfinished idea about work and about conversations and about discourse.
Mm-hmm. And I think that, I think this is something that I feel is hard to, I don't know, like for the uninitiated, I think it's difficult to get some sense of like buy-in to this like kind of nebulous thing. And I think the exhibition was a really productive way of allowing others into this, in some ways, exclusive thing. Right. In some ways, it's exclusive because there's only so many people that can come each year. And it's also remote in a way. And so I think these kinds of things allow access to the conversation.
Oh, yeah. And I think your point about exclusivity is really on the mark, because even as the number of gatherings have continued to multiply, it's still always limited. So
yes,
and even as they become perhaps geographically more expansive, the experience itself still requires some level of intimacy. But I think it's also a reminder that the gatherings themselves are really only a kind of jumpstart.
Yes.
And that, as several of my curator colleagues have repeatedly reminded us, design inquiry is a practice, the same way anything else is, and that it takes practice. And so that idea of continual designing, and meaning that both in terms of one's kind of professional work and personal work, but also in those things that we don't necessarily think of as connected to design, but should, our everyday lives, that's a practice, and that we have to work at it. And I would hope that that's, again, the thing that people take away from the exhibition is the possibility of taking on that notion that everything is a project in a really, in a positive way. My wife reminded me that I needed to send our accountant my list of honorarium that I've gotten this year, so that $50 here, $100 there, but I needed to make a list of it. And I said, that's okay. It'll be the honoraria project. And suddenly it becomes something that's fun to do rather than a heinous task that is associated with taxes.
Yes, the joy of giving up a piece of your honorarium to the tax man.
Yes, the piece of those. Well, it turns into fun what is otherwise a depressing project of, wait, I did all that and that's all I made.
Yes, it's symbolic. It's symbolic currency. As
I always say that to people, it's the gesture that's important.
You know what? I think oftentimes it is. It's like even if you pay me $50 to show up and do this thing.
No, it's really true.
Yeah.
I had a conversation. Someone had asked me to give a talk, and I ended up giving the keynote. And I got an email. This was not this calendar year, but the last calendar year. And I got an email from her, and she said, I have a check in front of me, but I don't really remember. That's already been cut, but I don't really remember how much. We said we were going to pay you. And this check was for a big $250 more than they had promised me. And I said, well, you promised me the lower amount, but it was a really good talk. So why don't you just give me the check that's already cut?
No need to retype that check.
Don't need to redo the check. And she's like, okay, that's actually a really good point.
It's your academic bonus.
Yes, my little incremental bonus. It's like the royalty checks I get for my first book, which every 3 years is enough to buy a cup of coffee with.
Oh, Yes. The wonders of publishing, right?
Ah, yes, indeed. Yes,
Yes.
indeed. Uh,
Um, so I am excited about our agenda for today's final episode.
yes, yes, indeed. And it's kind of fitting that we'll be talking with Karen Lewis, who is someone who's come to Design Inquiry a couple of times, and in that way that people meet at Design Inquiry, and then you realize that there are all of these other kinds of wonderful connections. I think that's the other fabulous thing about both the Futurespective and the, let's say, the larger project of Design Inquiry, is the way that it does allow us to create these, I guess we could call them, extra institutional networks.
Yeah.
That are, I think, increasingly important for people who work, both in and outside of the academy, for folks who work in and outside of institutions connected to all of our diverse design disciplines. And it's also a way to keep up with people. And I think that's one of the things I've appreciated about it. I mean, it's certainly how you and I came to collaborate on this project, for example.
And after we have our conversation with Karen, we're going to be left to our own devices here.
I know.
In the second half, where we will begin to interview each other.
Yes. Yes. And we'll see how that goes. Yeah. We'll see how that goes. It's going to turn into one of those I'm listening podcasts where or maybe not. I think it'll hopefully be as effective as the conversations that we've had with such an amazing group of friends, colleagues, future friends, future colleagues over the past 8 weeks. I think I've been continually amazed at, even when, because as our wide audience knows, we've talked to people kind of across the spectrum of design disciplines, in different, occupying all kinds of different spaces, and everyone still has the same challenges. Everyone is still asking really similar, challenging questions that, even if they're not directly translated to our practices, they're closely connected in some way. And everybody reads interesting stuff. And I think it's been a wonderful kind of a great learning curve in a positive way over the course of these 8 weeks. And it's one of those things that I always say, how does that conversation continue? Making sure that we all get out of our disciplinary and institutional boxes frequently enough to have those really important conversations and to learn from our colleagues kind of across the spectrum.
Yes, these kindred spirits all over, everywhere, not just in the Design Inquiry universe, but just out there in the universe in general.
I think it reminds us of the importance of seeking those things out and making that effort to call that person to have a drink or lunch or whatever when you know you're going to overlap in a given city for a conference or whatnot, because those conversations are always some of the most important. And it's certainly doing that, reaching out is certainly what has happened between myself and Karen Lewis over the years since we met at Design Inquiry. So
let me introduce her.
Absolutely.
Yes. So joining us today is Karen Lewis, an architect and designer who is Associate Professor of Architecture at The Ohio State University. A graduate of Wellesley College and the Graduate School of Design at Harvard, Karen is a thinker-maker whose research interests explore the intersection of graphic and infrastructural systems. Her 2015 book, Graphic Design for Architects, explores issues of architectural representation through the lens of information design and visual communication. Her design work includes such projects as Light Industrial Landscape, which explores the programmatic overlap of transportation and recreational systems in New York, and Resilience Network, a living landscape memorial in Connecticut that connects underused parks and recreational spaces with contemplative zones for reflection. Karen is currently studying the Oregon Trail, that iconic landmark of Western expansion as an ever-evolving networked landscape of transportation and communication technologies. Her archival research for this project has been supported by fellowships at the Newberry Library in Chicago and Dumbarton Oaks in Washington. Karen is also an intermittent design inquirer, and we are delighted to welcome her to Universal Lunch today. Welcome, Karen.
Thank you so much. I think I've officially, can you guys hear me?
Yes, you're fine.
Good. Okay. I think I've gotten the technology part down. So thank you so much for having me. It's really, really a pleasure to reconnect. And of course, Jimmy, to get to know you too. So thank you very, very much.
Yes. I have a soft spot in my heart for architects who engage with graphic design.
I'm so glad to hear that. Yes.
Karen, it sounds like that laugh is indicating that you've sometimes encountered graphic designers who don't have that soft spot.
Well, I think I'm always cognizant of being humble in the space of graphic design, because I would say architects have a reputation for being extremely confident in their abilities. And so the hubris that goes into graphic design for architects, that definitely, I think I have a sense of humility and recognition for the skills and practices that graphic designers bring to the discipline that far exceed the knowledge that I've acquired or gleaned along the way. So, yeah.
It's fabulous. We are happy to have you in the folds, you architects.
That's actually a perfect segue to what we want to start talking about, which is to ask you to tell us about your current practice as an architect, researcher, designer, and to kind of let our listeners know how you would situate yourself kind of on a disciplinary spectrum or within various design and disciplinary spheres.
So you both so beautifully said in the introduction that I situate my work at that entanglement of infrastructural and graphic systems. And I think for me, that starts to manifest itself as, I think, Gabrielle, you put it in the introductory notes really well, of a kind of embedded information that steps up inside of spaces and tools and systems that are performative in nature. So I would definitely situate myself as an architect more within the landscape architecture side of things. So Keller Easterling is somebody who I've definitely been inspired by as a thinker. Niraj Bhatia, Mason White, and Lola Shepard within Lateral. All practices of architecture that are kind of using these larger scale systems to cite architectural intervention. But I think recently too, I've also been very interested in the work of forensic architects. Mm-hmm. And so that is less infrastructural nature, but more embedded information and how we use tools of architecture to spatialize information, which I find a lot of sympathy with in the types of work that I'm interested in. So I think those are the colleagues and the people that I'm definitely inspired by when I think about my work. But I would also, somebody recently gave an introduction to my work, and they incredibly generously cited me next to John McPhee.
Oh, wow.
I was like, oh, yes, Pulitzer Prize winning author, John McPhee, plus Karen Lewis. That's an incredibly generous place to be, but also something that felt incredibly familiar, because I have long said every design project that I like to take on, John McPhee has probably already written about it. So I think there's a way that we are both looking at the systems of the world and also understanding the relationships of the social, the economic, and the kind of tangential like things that come out of those disciplines together. So
yeah, that's so interesting because, of course, when we think about McVie's work, the natural tendency is to assume first that he's talking about natural landscapes. So one of the great values of it is the way that he unpacks what we now call the Anthropocene, right? Like that we understand the way in which humans have so shaped the natural world. And of course, your work also looks at, I mean, even if there might be a natural element to it, but it is one that has been continually shaped by human interventions of various sorts, both historically and at present.
Absolutely. Like, how does a train situate itself inside of this very charismatic landscape? That's something that came up in the Newberry Library. When I was on my fellowship there, I discovered a set of documents. I mean, I say this, I discovered with that same humility that goes along with the fact that we don't ever discover anything. But what was new in architecture, and very few of my colleagues in landscape architecture had found this incredible document that the Army Corps of Topographic Engineers, so that was the kind of group before the Army Corps of Engineers, they developed a document, the reports and surveys of the Union Pacific Railroad. And so it was a set of documents that traversed each parallel of the United States as it was proceeding west, and documented those parallels in order to understand where one might put a train. And that being the hypothesis, where do we put a train? But the documentation was incredible. Exquisite drawings of grade changes and biology and artifacts and paintings of different populations that one would encounter along those traverses. So it was a really interesting kind of way that we would start to look at this intersection of technology within a space that is built entirely of human, natural, social systems.
And then also requiring a specific set of representational motifs in order to convey that. Absolutely. And would that have been train lines as well as stations and stops, et cetera?
That's so amazing. They don't really talk about the stops. You know? I think that tells you where their mind was.
Yeah.
But it wasn't even so much about this is where we would put the line as it was more about this is the territory where we might put the line. And each one of those parallels was being sponsored by different government agents back in Washington, each competing for their parallel to be the selected parallel. Of course, like, lines don't actually operate in such straight trajectories across the landscape, but it was a really interesting physical. It was a series of about 12 books, each one about yay thick, filled with drawings, filled with reports, filled with documentation, and the story of adventure. And maybe to kind of capitalize on that humility point of things, blind sort of cutting landscape, right? And how one would start to kind of signal that. But then the representation of it was also a tool of propaganda and persuasion inside of it as well. So, so that was something that I've been looking at rather exhaustively over the last few years.
I mean, what a treasure. That Newberry Library is also a treasure trove for graphic design.
Yes.
Yeah, lots of typographic
typefaces.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, the Newberry is like, there are certain places where you step into them for the first time and you feel like you've arrived home. And for me, it was like all the maps and all the typefaces. And then, of course, all of the greatest people who are both very playful and intellectual, but warm-hearted. And it's a great place to be. I couldn't recommend the Newberry Library enough. Yeah.
And do you feel that as you approach, say, projects like that, those volumes produced by and can you tell us their name again, the precursor to the Army Corps of Engineers?
Oh, the Army Corps of Topographic Engineers.
Topographic Engineers. Do you feel like, that your approach is that of a forensic architect?
Maybe. I mean, I definitely feel like it's interesting to have this conversation with you both at this moment because I've been transitioning so much since the book. You know, we were certainly referencing that. The book, getting tenure, making some major changes in my life, and then also now recently becoming the chair of undergraduate studies in architecture. It's like a pivot point in my career. And so it's been an interesting pivot point to be assembling information. And so as a designer, I think I've always taken on shorter design prompts, have been working over ideas much more quickly. The design process is one that I can approach a lot more quickly than, say, a writing process. Writing for me is just the longest, most difficult kind of project in the world. So mad props to those of us on this call that are really good writers. But it definitely kind of into this position of, okay, what's the design project that is archivally or forensically in nature? So it's not quite the same as a design prompt, and it's not the same as a writing research project, but it's a kind of design research project that I'm trying to find kind of footing within. And so that's been fascinating prompt to sort of look forward towards. So, yeah.
Can we unpack this term? I've never, this is my ignorance of architecture, is I've never come across this term, forensic architecture. Can you unpack that for me, graphic designer?
Sure, absolutely.
Yes.
So I'm like looking at my bookshelf right now. Hold on for just a second.
Jimmy, while Karen's doing that, surely are you old enough to remember the television show Quincy?
No, I'm not.
He was a medical examiner who dealt a lot with forensics.
Yes, I'm familiar with forensics, so I can imagine what forensic architect might mean, but I'm curious to hear you unpack that a little bit for myself and perhaps for our vast audience out there in internet land.
So forensic architecture is a practice right now that Eyal Weissman has been sort of bringing forward at the London School of Economics, which I think is also fascinating that institution is tied to design. And I would say the practice, forensic architecture, is about uncovering. So the forensic part is the act of uncovering, sorting through, assessing, amassing, gathering information. And then the architecture part, I would say, is about visualizing or distributing those things spatially. Using the tools of mapping, using the tools of diagramming, much like a police report might go to a crime scene and model the crime scene. Forensic architects, they would probably take on that same site, model that site, but then use the site as a way of holding the pieces of information that they've uncovered from either witnesses, photographs, reports. I mean, I guess like the moment that comes to mind for me of a forensic architecture moment is a little bit like in season 1 of The Wire.
Okay. You're speaking my language
We're with you. We're with you.
Cool. It's so cool. So when McNulty and Bunch are uncovering the bullet that has been embedded in the wall and that has been covered up, and they just use that great single word to unfold that moment, and it's through an act of like over here, assessing, using the photographs to reposition themselves, and then they're able to uncover something. So without actually being in the space and without actually having the talents of McNulty and Bunch, Rhino.
Just Rhino.
Yeah, just Rhino, and maybe a little illustrator to kind of reassemble that narrative. So, and
it's interesting too because
too.
It's also a kind of critical redeployment of the more mundane discipline of forensic architecture, in which I had a PhD student who was employed as a forensic architect by the city of New York, who would, where you would go and you would deal with issues of not as extreme as building collapse, but sometimes, you have code violations and they send in an inspector to look at what the hell's going on there. And why is there persistent leakage? Why is there a potential stress on the structure in this way? And so they act literally, as a forensic detective, only in the realms of built form.
Wow, that's amazing. Yeah. I mean, I have to imagine that the project of the New York subway right now is almost one of forensic architecture, because it's like such a complicated and embedded system that is so hard to untangle.
Yeah, and that has to be understood sectionally.
Definitely.
in both architectural and graphic ways, I think.
Yes.
Right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. That's one of the things I think, back to this discussion of trains, that I've always loved is it would fascinate me. I felt this in Chicago many, many years ago, more so than in New York. I think because New York, you're in such a thing.
Yeah.
Like you go into it and it's very clear that you're in this thing, and it might be jerry-rigged, but you're in it.
Yeah.
At least in Chicago, you tend to look at the L quite a bit because it's not underground that much.
Yeah.
So you would have this very crazy thing that would very idiosyncratically navigate around buildings or up and down or change section or what have you. And it doesn't matter like what the thing is doing. All you needed to know was what the sign was, where the staircase was, where the turnstile was. And it was a graphic project kind of in deployed in the cities. Like all you needed was that little package of signals. Like in New York, you look for the green ball and you look for the, Helvetica. And it was really funny. The first time that I tried to go from the L in Chicago to the Metra, this was about 5 or 6 years ago, I couldn't find the Metra. I'm like,
it's hard. Yeah.
Oh my gosh, it's so hard. Why is it so hard? And then, of course, like the New Englander in me was like, well, in New York, we don't have this problem. Blah, blah, blah. So anyway, that's where the humility leaves itself.
It shifts into hubris.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
But I thought that was an interesting kind of moment of like user interface in real time in the city, and then how you jump from one system to the next. And of course, probably the lack of clarity is that those are two entirely different agencies. Those are two entirely different financial structures. And so there's probably a whole series of politics between those two blocks that like link the L to the Metra. That's probably a forensic project that I could probably get into at some point too. So.
Oh, absolutely. And one that repeats itself all over the country and the world, right? I mean, in New York, we have the distinction between the path and the subway, and you nailed it precisely on why those differences exist. And we should in fact be thinking about how we map them economically as well as out in the landscape itself.
Yeah, and like what those artifacts are. I mean, I've always found that. So growing up in Connecticut, like Metro North is my kind of New York like sort of thing that I most understand, and it was like, how do you understand one system over here and then this system over here, and then how do you make that little leap? Like, what is the signage system? And so I think that's the architect part of me that has immediately stepped into graphic design. It was through that moment of understanding broken systems and how do you fix those broken systems, or how do you create the physical link of understanding. And so how you move from one to the next is always signage. And so that's been really interesting for me to unpack as well.
Although talking about Metro North, I mean, Grand Central itself is also the perfect example of a building that allowed that kind of cueing you about movement without signage, because it's such a classic kind of Beaux-Arts composition of spatial contraction and expansion that like literally signals how you're supposed to move through a given space. And so it's really, really interesting to kind of think about how we map those systems or fail to.
Yeah. And then once you get into the dazzle of the main space with the the clock and the ceiling, etc. Okay, where's Metro North now? And it's like you go hunting and pecking again. For that. Like, I got to get compressed again.
Yeah, exactly.
It's over here or something like that. So, but yeah, no, Grand Central Terminal is probably one of my favorite buildings. For all of those reasons of its kind of gooiness and the fact that it moves people and trains and stacks them and layers them. And so probably one of my favorite buildings on earth.
Karen, we now want to perform some forensics on you. So at Universal Lunch, this is our question that we try to get everyone to answer, because we're interested in not just the work you're producing, but also the ideas that feed that work. And we want to see if you can trace a line backwards through your career and or education, and try to unpack any formative experiences, institutions, or people who might have shaped what we might call your particular school of thought. So can you perform some forensics on Karen for us?
Oh my gosh. Sure. Well, I know I have had a little bit of time to think about this question, but I think the way you just phrased it has inspired me to think about it in other ways.
Okay, good.
Which is interesting. I guess, so my first memory was crawling at the age of, I think, 9 months.
Wow.
I know this is all like a story to show how brilliant I am right now. No, but my first memory was crawling, and I remember it was apparently I went to visit my great grandmother, and she lived in a mobile home. And I thought it was I remember thinking this is very strange that the kitchen and the bedroom are on the same floor. So at a tender age, I was always, I think, as my friend Sarah Cowles might say, when I walked into a lunch setup at school a couple years ago, and I said, why is it organized this way? Like, why was the forks over here and this was over here, da, da, da. And Sarah lovingly said, and that will be what's on your tombstone. Probably fed up. Like, why is this organized this way? Like, why is the bedroom next to the kitchen? And then I think that same sort of thing shows up. I grew up, and I think it's probably appropriate for us to be thinking about this because we're coming up, I think, on the 7th year anniversary of the very tragic massacre at Sandy Hook Elementary School. I grew up in Newtown, Connecticut, and went to Hedda Meadow Elementary School. And so Hedda Meadow had a really distinct floor plan, and one-story elementary school, but it had all of these circles circumscribed into the plan of the school. And so sometimes those circles would be like a bathroom. So they would be smaller and they'd be a bathroom. Sometimes they'd be very large and they would be a sectional pit where the students would sit and gather for story hour. Sometimes they would be a reading room that would kind of extend off. And then very dramatically, I remember being in kindergarten, you'd sit in the pit and it was like a quarter circle. And then on the other side of the wall, it took me a while to realize this, was the 4th grade classroom. And I remember sitting in one day in 4th grade, they opened up the wall between 4th grade and the kindergarten, and all of our little minds were just blown, right? Because we had moved from one section of the school into like quite another section of the school years later and not quite understood the plan. And I feel like that was a moment when I understood the plan like very, very well. So I think like assembling images and components and things like that has been something that's always been of interest to me. When I went to undergrad and I decided to go to Wellesley College because I wanted to go to an institution that was, that I think was like, well, backing up, I had just spent some of my part of high school studying sociology. And we had our, 2 or 3 week long discussion on gender, right? Like, welcome to gender, here it is. And I remember being quite like eye-open and sort of surprised. And that was a moment in my development where we all started reading, and this is going to show my age. We were reading The Beauty Myth and Backlash, and Hillary Clinton was suddenly going to be the first lady, and Matthew Albright. It's I think, Gabrielle, I know you can probably relate to stories too, having gone to Smith. But I wanted to go to an institution that would support and augment the activities and the thinking and the living of women in society. And I remember somebody saying to me that this was an institution that was going to, there was no men's basketball team, women's basketball team, just the basketball team. And they were all women. And it wasn't going to be interesting that the school president was a woman. It was just, of course, it's a woman because it's a women's college. And so when I went to Wellesley, I went to that institution because I really wanted to just be unencumbered and know that, not that the message that I could do anything, but the expectation that I could and I would do anything was very important for me. And I think from there, it also inspired me to then go to MIT and start taking architecture classes at MIT. And so Wellesley and MIT have this really great cross-registration experience where we can take classes that are not offered at Wellesley at MIT. And it was a really fantastic opportunity for me to then step into architecture. And that was when all of these great questions started to emerge. And the professors that I met at MIT were really exceptional. Duke Reiter was one of them. And I guess I had Duke a couple of times. Bill Hubbard, he's a sort of institution at MIT. Ann Pendleton Julian, who is now a colleague of mine at Ohio State. And so kind of thinking through that method of going through those different types of things. And I'm suddenly feeling like I'm talking very, very long time about like, let me start with when I was born.
No, it's great.
These are great, yeah.
But fast forwarding, I think after studying architecture, I worked in New York for quite a bit of time as a museum exhibition designer and as an information designer in the .com bubble of the early.
Oh, fascinating.
Yeah, it was a very exciting time. And I was working at a firm called Icon Nicholson that did a lot of the interactive developments for the Museum of Modern Art, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and the Pequot Museum. And they were doing a lot of museum work and kind of interactive experiences. And I found that kind of work from museums into information as being another one of those reassembling of narratives, whether it be the bathroom is on the same floor as the kitchen, or we need to retell the story about colonial chairs in a particular way, and how we're going to sort of sequence that information in a way that makes sense to other people. So after having those experiences, I went to Harvard for graduate school, where I had some really incredible professors. John Stilgo was one of the professors in the landscape department who had a big impact on me. And certainly the design work that I did with Sarah Whiting, who's now the dean there, Ron Whitty, Michael Bell, who's a visiting professor. But it really kind of became an extraordinary opportunity to think about not just architecture as a discipline of building assembly and programmatic assembly, but to scale that in a way that could start to incorporate things such as landscape, to be kind of composing and organizing embedded systems of information that then start to have a kind of sequence to them. And so I think that's always been some of the work that has driven me, and that's been part of the curiosity and experiences that I've had, alongside with this fascination with train systems and their signage and things like that we've already kind of alluded to. So, yeah.
It's always interesting to hear our guests, and also just in general, people talking about that kind of moment of crossover between the thing that you either observed in your, say, childhood, or recollect in your childhood, put it into an educational situation where somehow it was perhaps validated or tapped into, and then translating that into your own work. And I think one of the most interesting things that we've seen happen over these past 8 weeks is people doing just that. Like, this thing happened when I was a kid that I remember, that then informed what I studied, that then informed the work that I'm doing now. And it sort of reminds me of how useful it is to reflect on these things.
Sure.
As we continually think about what the next big move is going to be.
Yeah.
It also reveals, of course, the degree to which all of us have OCD tendencies.
Probably.
But I think you're in, the way that you were tracing that line for us is it's almost as if you've always been thinking about that nexus between graphic and what we call disciplinarily graphic design and architecture. And that nexus certainly informed your 2015 book, Graphic Design for Architects. Can you talk a little bit about that project? And I'm specifically interested in how you came to thinking about producing a sort of manual primer, which is a very distinct kind of project, one that's sort of intellectual, creative, pedagogical, and so on.
Yeah, I think it was because I was looking for that information and it didn't exist for me. and I found that there was a lot of books about typography. Ellen Lupton, which, by the way, I saw J. Abbott Miller give a lecture at Wellesley, and that definitely was like a big link. Like, I was like, oh, someone is speaking about all the things I love at once. And so I know. And so there were lots of books about typography. There were lots of books about layout, but it was really explicitly for graphic designers. And at this moment, I think of, I was the last class at the GSD that drew anything by hand the first year. So we were like the last moment. And so that everyone had a laptop. Everyone was using Illustrator and eventually InDesign, Quark back in the day.
Yes.
I know, right? I know. And it suddenly became a project of how do you present this information if you're not drawing it? And there's other information that needs to be reconciled with. And of course, even the selection of typefaces, like how are you going to label your work? It starts to push it into one direction or another, and set tones, and sort of that became another part of the design project that was frustratingly open for me. And so I've always kind of been one of those oldest daughters who was like, probably, let me put this all together for you in a checklist, like very, very helpful. And it was something that sort of struck me as a missing set of information. I was able to find it in a lot of other places, but I didn't have it specifically for architects. And within that, it wasn't just about layout and portfolios and resumes and all the things that we all have responsibility for, but it also got into things like making maps, and how do you make a map that has clarity to it, or productive obfuscation, and then how do you draw diagrams that are going to explain, that had a lot to do with what I was seeing as a kind of graphic ethos, and a graphic ethos that was maybe more aligned with how do I clarify where the Metro North is in relationship to the subway, than say how do I express a particular idea, concept inside of a graphic position, which I think a lot of graphic designers do much better than I do. I tend to take like a bunch of information and I can kind of sort it and organize it and give it hierarchy and shape it. But I think we just had a colleague of ours hire a graphic designer to develop a poster, and she was like, I want to hire somebody who can do something I can't do. And that was like a whole other level of design thinking that I thought was really, really fascinating. And ironically, when I was on my sabbatical in Chicago, I ended up having lunch with Bud Roediger.
Bud, a fellow design inquirer.
Exactly. And Bud and I met during, I think, both of our first design inquiry instances. And I met Bud for lunch, and we were talking, and he was like, oh, you live in that building. I did all the graphics for that building. And like the posters on each letter, it's like the ground floors or first floor is A, second floor is B, et cetera. And they have like all the alphabet. And so, of course, I walk out and I realize that design inquiry is shaping the place where I'm living. So anyway, and that's like so beautiful and so artistic. And that is definitely not my area of expertise. And so I think that's like a great moment of seeing how that kind of like expressive, almost painterly qualities of bringing presence to a space is unique to somebody like Bud and Thirst and the work that they were doing. So
Karen, I'm curious about, if these resources didn't exist in one place for architects, I'm curious if you could think with us about, where do architects and in their education, how do they get the knowledge? Because like, where does that domain, where does that knowledge come from for architects? Because you have to grapple with the issues that are at the core of graphic design. Always, you do, but you are not necessarily being trained in graphic design. So like, how do architects really in their education grapple with that idea?
Yeah, and maybe this is something we can untangle together.
Yes.
let's see, how do we get this? Well, I think it starts with a kind of flattening of the three-dimensional world. And so there's definitely a lot of training about how to draw a plan in a section of a building. And there's like a lot of discussion about that and a lot of disciplinary history about how to present those things.
And that's like inherently graphic, right? Yeah.
Yes.
I mean, as Michael Rock said when I interviewed him for my book, he was like, it's all graphic design. He's like, aside from making a model, you guys are graphic designers. The subject is architecture, but like,
interesting.
it's all graphic design. And I was like, okay, interesting. So it definitely comes into a project that might, all the same issues of composition or clarity, hierarchy, those things are, I think, on the perimeter of the topics that we speak about as architects. But they're then brought forward through a kind of technical language of heavy line weight is for cutting through thick walls, light line weight is doing this. And so there's a kind of, it's interesting that as much as architecture is, so, or at least in the academy, is so much about these kind of disciplinary speculation, I think a lot of the way that we speak about communication is very technical in its terms, right? So I think there's that. And Gabrielle, do you want to chime in with any of this?
Well, I think you're quite right in that tension that exists between what is the architecture and what is the graphic design. And for me, it's always come down to, and this is of course a kind of pedagogical struggle, it's explaining that architecture is a system of representation, at least in terms of how it is communicated in forms that are beyond the actual building. I mean, even as a building, it's a system of communication. But in essence, for the entire time that you're in school, you are making representations. You are not, in fact, making the thing itself. Even if in the world that we live in now, even if BIM allows us to build these kind of increasingly data-filled and nearly the thing itself, as Tom Main has kind of talked about it. But I think that, to me, the real tension there is, how do you teach students to make architecture as a system of representation that requires them to utilize tools and techniques of a different discipline? And it's always that, and that I think is the real rub, right? That because even if we accept that, say, line weights, to use something really simplistic, that line weights are critical and that they are part of architecture, their value is derived from graphic design, like, at least as we comprehend it now. So I think I think it's a real struggle. And to answer Jimmy's question, schools are always trying to figure out the place for it. And sure, you reinforce it continually in studio and other courses, but it's also about, well, where do we teach them this that doesn't dissolve, to your point about being the last class to sort of do analog, kind of pre-computer, that doesn't devolve into teaching software.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so I think it's also, I feel like there's so many things that are part of how we communicate about architecture that it's understood in, I think, schools, that it's something that you're going to kind of pick up along the way. Like, you'll be exposed to enough that you'll just kind of pick it up. And it's baffling to me. Like, I see students, I feel like I'm going to show them every sort of gorgeous example of how to, like, I'm even going to give them a template sometimes. Like, this is how you're going to label your drawings. And they don't do it. Like, they choose something else, which is interesting to me. Okay, why would you make another choice? Cool. All right, let's talk about what that means. But then they often make choices that are just so different than the way that the work is doing. It's like getting dressed for, going to an evening at the opera, and you are like putting on a winter scarf and some sneakers and like a ball gown, and it's like you're just kind of assembling clothes, right? Without realizing that there's kind of like a system in place of like relational thinking, or how do you start to play with those things, and how do you usurp some of the conventions. So, it's something that we talk about teaching. It's sort of in the water, right? And then it's like, hey boys, how's the water? And then the fish are like, what's water?
Yes, exactly.
That we definitely are in those moments of how do we start to say it. And so the book was something that was about claiming that territory that even within the educational structure of our programs is less and less clear about where it exists, and yet more and more important as we start to ask for different types of representations and different ways of communicating, and different audiences that might require different tools or techniques and things like that. Even to the point where the PS1 competition, which is now also a dinosaur,
a historical artifact,
right?
And that's the PS1 competition to design a temporary installation in the courtyard at what is now the Museum of Modern Art's PS1 exhibition space in Queens.
Yeah, thank you. But they ask for less and less classically architectural representations, but they're asking for books, they're asking for renderings, they're asking for other forms of representing those ideas that are increasingly less architecturally specific, / architecture is becoming more embracing of these other forms.
Well, I mean, I think that's what's fascinating to me about the overlap between architecture and graphic design, is that there seems to be a recurring history of what I guess one might call like paper architecture, or architects who are interested in the representation of not just of buildings, but of ideas and of language. And I think that's when the crossover happens for what I've observed. People like Jimenez Lai, or my friend Stuart Hicks, who teaches at University of Illinois. Like, they're architects who are interested in not just the representation of space, but also the representation of ideas. And I think that's when the necessary crossover happens, because like I think of graphic design as the visual representation of language. And I think I love seeing what happens when architects begin to think beyond representing buildings and into seeing how we can represent how they can represent other things graphically.
Yeah, and I think it's not something it's as Karen has pointed out, it seems like it's something that is coming increasingly to the fore. But of course, if we go back to the 1920s, Corbusier in a book like Version d'Architecture was absolutely engaged in a project of polemical graphic design. That the book itself was intended to use the relationship of image and text in order to make this larger kind of commentary about how we comprehended contemporary culture and could potentially use that in built form. So we see it in a different way now, probably because, as Karen's been talking about, probably because our tools have changed. But even then, that kind of appropriation of the language of advertising, which was itself both graphic language and textual language of advertising, which was itself graphic design.
Yeah.
So, Karen, so it's been about almost 5 years since the book's publication. I'm curious to know your thoughts about architecture's quote-unquote expanded vocabulary of representation and representational techniques. Has architecture's infographic data visualization moment passed, or is it an ongoing act of reckoning within the discipline?
I love that question, because that is something that I've thought a lot about as well. About probably 10 years ago, when this book first was conceived, we were at the height of infographics. Everybody seemed to think that was going to be something that was incredibly important for all of us. And I would say that kind of simplification of information, I don't think that we're in a world that needs to simplify information anymore. I mean, in some ways, we need more specific tools. And I know we all say that with a kind of wry laughter. a really good colleague of mine, Christy Sheremy, who's going to be the head of the landscape architecture section here, floated this idea to me the other day, and I have not been able to stop thinking about it, is that we've lost our ability to be subtle. And that certainly even politically right now, we are in a moment where things have to be so extreme, so uncontestedly obvious into one direction in order for there to be decisions made, or things called that we no longer have the tools of subtlety. And I would say that maybe a couple of years ago, we were all trying to find those tools of clarification and opening up. I know Scott Stowell did a really interesting set of brochures right before the 2008 election that were available in Starbucks. They were like mini papers that you could unfold, and they were these infographics about contemporary issues and things that were important to all of us as we're moving into a broader political realm. And those types of tools are not as present anymore. And I don't think that that's a bad thing. As Laura Kurgan says, there's a big difference between information graphics and data visualizations. We're in the kind of height of data visualizations. I think forensic architecture is doing that really, really beautifully. I was also very impressed at the Chicago Architecture Biennial this year, the Somatic collaboration, which is Philippe Carrera and Devin Dobrowski. They did a really set of drawings that were very specific, cartographic, diagrammatic mappings that were really, really specific, that you had to like get into them. You had to stare into them very deeply. And for me, that was like one of the most compelling and sophisticated exhibits at the biennial. And so I think that whereas we might not be in this data graphic moment or infographic moment anymore, I think we've matured into a more detailed and more nuanced tools of representation that are much more delicate, much more layered, much more Kate Orff and Petrochemical America, much more layered and sophisticated, and taking on stacking deeper sets of information. And so I never saw the book that I designed as part of a data or infographic kind of realm, although there's a chapter on infographics that interestingly I might change to data visualization. I'm working on the second edition of the book right now. And that still some of those same principles about how do you clarify information, how do you stack, and how do you layer. How much of that are you going to do? Are you going to do one layer of information, 2, 3, 10? How do you bring that forward into an audience that I think hopefully we're all being able to, I think we're craving depth. I think we're craving more slower things. I think we're craving subtlety.
I think that's a really go ahead. Go. Yeah.
I was just going to ask Karen to comment on subtlety and complexity. Do you think those are they part of the same continuum?
Oh, that's beautiful. I don't know. What do you think?
I was, as you were speaking, I kind of understand that. Yeah, I absolutely agree that we live in a kind of cheap, even when it's not specifically a cheap shot, but yes, cheap shot, easy shot, right? Easy shot.
Twitter shot.
Yeah, and like the kind of gotcha culture, which has come to take the place of nuanced discussions. And to me, subtlety requires a kind of complexity that you sort of rely on. You rely on perhaps knowledge, not necessarily knowledge or sophistication, but you rely on the sufficient interest on the part of your audience, whether that's political discourse or literature or art. I wonder. I mean, to me, they are related. I don't know.
I mean, I think we're definitely. I'm surprised that we're having a rise in podcasts and like long form journalism that's happening in podcasts, and I think that's a great example of places where complex arguments are being shared, that you're seeing like threads, and each day it's not just a linear progression of a situation, but it might be multiple threads that are stacking and changing and moving on top of one another. And even like some of the journalism that television programs are doing, the documentaries that they show, I find there to be a really fascinating sort of, I think, fidelity to complexity. And show and the subtleties of that. So I think you're right. I haven't thought about it enough that I don't necessarily, but I think there is something about that where it's multiple ways of understanding something. It's not just, and I think maybe that's what the infographic did that makes me a little uncomfortable, is that it sort of took something very complicated and just made it a snapshot. And so, yeah.
Well, I mean, I think there was a moment for graphic design in particular where, in the, early 2000s, when like Good magazine came out, where everyone became interested in information graphics and visualization in a way that felt thin to me. Like a lot of the interests, like people, it was just like a veneer of like, yes, we're presenting this really complex information, but the actual graphics themselves were not very complex. And like, perhaps I'm curious. I was going to ask you earlier about, it seems like an appropriate time for us to renew some interest in the work of someone like Edward Tufte, who wrote those 3 books. And I mean, he's been continuously talking about it, but, Tufte's argument is about he's saying clarity comes when the information is more dense. Like when he argues for complexity, he's like, let's not make it simpler. Let's make it more complex. Let's make the graphs more dense. That's how we truly can get a more nuanced explanation of something, is that the more that you can pack in there. He's not arguing for simplicity, he's arguing for complexity. And so I'm curious, like, has he fallen out of fashion with folks? Because I feel like he's fallen out of fashion for sure with graphic designers, but I'm curious if he ever comes up in architecture circles.
He does. I think with not quite as much as he used to, but I definitely think that Edward Tufte, like, if you need to verify some of the work that you're doing in architecture school, you can bring up Tufte. And I think you're right. Like I think of those beautiful examples of the meteorological diagrams that he shares, where it's not about losing information, but it's about shaping information so that you can look into it and see it with that depth. But you're right, the infographic moment of Good magazine, and I know Scott was really important into the development of some of that work, had that moment of glossing over some bigger things. I think a couple of years ago, I remember getting a few comments in some of the work that I was showing that was similar, right? That was a kind of similar, like, are you telling the whole picture, or are you lying? Like, nobody was said, are you lying? But I think there was like a sort of, but there was kind of a feeling like you're shaping the truth that you want. And well, we kind of all are in a certain degree, right? Like,
truly.
Like who I am and my life experiences, I show up into the world and I'm going to perceive a situation much differently than somebody else with different set of experiences. But I remember sharing, I think like the very first photograph that was of somebody from like the head up. People thought that the person had been decapitated. Oh. And it was like, no, and we were all reconciling with what these tools were doing. And so, like cropping a body did not mean that the actual body was cropped. Or when my parents were first, I say my parents, were first playing Nintendo and they would want to make the character jump, they would like move their hands like this in order to make the character jump across the screen.
That's adorable.
But we all do it, right? Like we're all reconciling with these ways that technology and information and image is changing in the way that we start to have those different tools. So I think that, how we work with those things, we may not be experts at them at first. We may never become experts at them, but it is going to be an evolving, hopefully, trajectory, but something that evolves as we start to understand. And I definitely, I think shortly before the book came out, I learned GIS. which was a tool that was not, so that's geographic information systems. It's a mapping tool. And that was not something that was as potent inside of my architectural education as it is now inside of the discipline. And that definitely gave me a tool to start graphically developing a database. That was something that was very revealing and very inspiring for the work that I did. So I think in that same way that we are developing new tools and we're practicing new methods of information sharing, that's going to evolve the tools as we think through them in the disciplines.
That also suggests the way in which we ourselves are being changed by those tools. Because certainly the examples of people seeing early photographs and being concerned that the person had been decapitated. There are comparable stories about motion pictures that audiences having the same response, and the things that we now take for granted in terms of digital technologies, et cetera, that we first kind of had to learn how to use. And that, to me, that brings up this question of that you've been sort of hinting at in terms of representation and kind of form and content, and sort of a relationship between form and content. Can you talk a little bit about that? And it also, I think, gets to the question that might have been asked of your work. Like, are you lying? Are you telling the full story? Because it suggests that we all know in this, as post-structuralist subjects, that that there is no sort of single truth, that there is no single foundation, but that we're always selecting and editing, which of course is about the balance between form and content. So how would you just address that? There was a question in there somewhere, but maybe it's just throwing out some issues.
Yeah. So this is the way that information shapes form. Maybe that's one of the questions. Is a huge anxiety for me, because information doesn't immediately shape form. Like, information is almost formless, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. And so I started making a series of books, actually, for myself, that were like, okay, where are the examples of forms of information? Like, what are those examples? And so I would start with things like Louis Kahn's plan of Philadelphia, which is the form of a city through its movements. So it's kind of adjacent to. And it would even run into things like the forms of train tracks. Like, those are systems entirely derived by their mechanics of the physical thing, but that they have a particular form and a particular grace to them that I am drawn to. And so it was a hard thing for me to admit that I had a tendency towards particular shapes, right? Because I'd filled my mind and I'd filled my life with so much information, right?
I mean, we all do. We all have shapes that we are drawn to.
Yeah, and I felt like it was sort of, I think we do, right? And having, it's funny, we don't talk about forms that we choose with as much interrogation as when we are shaping information. Like, there's an information shaping that I think because the content is, maybe it's verbal or it's words or it's data or it's numbers or something like that. It's not shapes. I've seen a lot of architects, like even some of the architects that you mentioned earlier, Jimmy, that, they're using figure in order to explore further figures, versus like using information to then adjacently come up with a figure that then is starting to maybe bring out other sets of information. So I think it's an interesting challenge, and I appreciate this question, because it's something that I don't think I've done a lot of verbalizing about. So, yeah.
It's almost as if we have to think through. One does some work, and then one has to critique one's own work, bringing those different perspectives to it.
Yeah. It's interesting, actually. The place where I start to find it easier to bring multiple kind of questions to bear on form is in model making. And so it's like, oh, let's no longer be graphic.
Right. Yeah.
According to Michael Rock, right? When I build a model, I'm able to maybe integrate some of those things a little bit more quickly. And so I actually just started a model. I mean,
is that a digital model or an analog model?
A physical model. A physical model. Yeah. A physical model based on not program. Like, we have a lot of examples in the discipline of architecture where program has yielded a couple of particular forms. I'm thinking of like the double house, or certainly any MVRDV or OMA project, that moment in the Dutch, the Dutch contingency, where programmatic ideas yielded particular architectural forms. And I'm wondering now if there's not the same way that we can think of program as having specific form as like spaces and information of time of having particular forms. And so this is a little bit of some of the work that I've been doing with the Oregon Trail. I've been looking at the system of fur trading, which all historians seems like speaks about the fur trade, right? Remember that good old day of the fur trade? They speak about it as a system. And that's just really interesting to me, that word is embraced by historians of economics, if you will. And so then as I've been mapping and sort of layering and distilling the complexity, right? Layering complexity in order to understand and shape it, I sense that there's a form that is emerging, and I want to model it. So I will share it with you guys where I can like even speak about it more. But it's definitely a curious moment inside of, I think, assembling multiple pressures, maybe. Yeah, I don't know.
You got to surround yourself with more graphic designers, Karen. Like, that is, yeah, you do. Like, because I think that's the central question of our discipline is, what is the shape of information? What is the shape of words? What is the shape of ideas? Like, that's
beautiful.
Yeah.
Well, I've come to the right place then.
Yeah.
I've continued to the right place. Yeah.
We are quickly running out of time with you. It's been such a pleasure to talk to you today. Are there any things that we can look forward to in your practice that are coming up for you that you can share with our audience, or just me and Gabrielle? The second edition of your book is
the second edition of my book is coming out, and hopefully I'm working on an exhibition about the Oregon Trail. So hopefully we'll start to see some of those pieces emerge. But it's been a lot of things happening in the last few years, so it's good to have those. I think a conversation like this is inspiring for sharing some of that work. So I really, really appreciate the invitation and the opportunity. And gosh, what a delight. Like, I feel like we could do this every week. Like, this is really, really nice. So thank you.
It's very mutual.
Welcome.
Yeah,
you're welcome.
What a really great idea. Thank you so much for the invitation. I'm super honored.
Well, we were delighted to have you on our last episode. But I think you're bringing up the thing that we've been grappling with is, wow, why can't we make the space for this somehow in some form, at least on a more regular basis? Because I think it's valuable for us, for the folks who listen to the who watch the episodes afterwards. So thanks for so much provocative discussion.
Sure. And thank you so much for having me. And Jimmy, you're in Austin, Texas right now?
I am.
I just came back from Austin, Texas.
Okay, next time we'll have to make our paths cross.
I know. I was staying at the Hotel San Jose.
Oh, lucky you. That's a great place.
I know the honor. They're like, you can have an honorarium. And I'm like, or I could stay at the Hotel San Jose.
Yes, worth it for sure.
I loved it. It was like
it'll cost you an entire honorarium.
It was definitely a soul nurturing moment, but
very good.
But I had the best time. It has been 13 years since I was in Texas, and it was it was just a really, really beautiful, special place, and it's grown so much, and it's really, it was really inspiring. So I know, probably, but I look forward to meeting you in person. And Gabrielle, I can't wait to. Are you coming back to Columbus anytime soon?
I might be there sometime in the spring. Yeah, I probably will be there, and of course, I will let you know.
Please do. By the way, side note, I have. I was thinking if you are coming through in the spring, and with your new book, we've been having a couple of small like lecture series that I run like the Cool Kids lecture series.
All right.
I come through and want to get a slot and share your book, we would be so thrilled to have you.
Oh, great. Well, I will definitely
talk about that.
Yes,
Book tour 2020.
Book tour, yes.
I know.
Ongoing.
Exactly. So, all right. Well, thank you again, you guys.
You're welcome. And the conversation will continue.
I look forward to that. Okay. See you guys. Bye.
Bye. Jimmy, our last interview on our last episode.
I know, it's so strange to just only see you on the screen now. I'm like, wait, where are the other squares?
Yeah, those squares. Where'd those squares go?
Where did those squares go? Only rectangles here.
Here we are. It is so true though. The delight of having in the midst of all the chaos that's going on in our respective weeks, running from one thing to another, balancing this, that, and the other, and then going, oh, Thursday, I can just close the door for 2 hours and talk about the stuff that brought us into what we do in the first place, which is kicking around ideas, having amazing conversations with really interesting people, getting inspired by what they're reading. It's just, I wish this was our life.
Yeah, I mean, I was at the end of the semester, I have individual meetings with all the students to kind of wrap up and answer questions that are lingering. And one of the students this morning I was asking them, like, I was making a remark that they seemed unusually quiet in class this semester. And this is a pretty precocious, a normally pretty precocious person. And they were telling me that, well, I thought whatever I had to say was just so basic, and I didn't want to burden the class with hearing that. And I didn't think I was going to contribute the kind of discourse that you were looking for. And we had an interesting conversation about that because, I'm going to bring this back to Universal Lunch, I promise. It's really good. I am going somewhere with this. But that the idea that conversation and dialogue is the way that we can develop a more sophisticated position about something is, I think, the kind of point of having conversations, that even though it may sound like, I don't think I was like always 100% brilliant on Universal Lunch, but I think the fact that we were able to host a forum that allowed the conversation to exist at all is a contribution to advancing the sophistication and the momentum of all of our disciplines. I was bringing up, the ancient Greeks, that, most of that knowledge is in the form of dialogues. And I think that there is a real good reason for that. I was telling that to my student, is that, I don't think that was an accident, that these brilliant philosophers all were actualizing their knowledge through conversation.
Yeah, through the symposium and the convivium. I mean, absolutely, because it was about the exchange. It wasn't about a later kind of, not just Western, but a later model of sort of higher education in which there's the master kind of speaking, particularly the professor speaking to the student, right? It's that exchange of ideas that, again, too often we get locked into. Even if we're not in the academy, like there's a perception that in the academy, there's all this opportunity for this kind of exchange, but of course there's not, because we're whether you're on a semester system or a quarter system, you're constantly working against those various deadlines of projects being due, et cetera. and that even when we make space to have those conversations, they're just always so bounded. And this has seemed, I think, precisely because this is outside of, it ends up being a much more open forum. But it's that back and forth, and it's about asking the same questions of a number of different people and listening to their responses and reflecting on those afterwards. I think that's the thing I keep coming back to, is the stuff that has been staying with me, and thinking about and making notes on, like, need to follow up about. I think has been the most, again, I don't want to say useful, because in some ways it doesn't need to have utility.
Yes.
It can also just be.
Yes.
But I think your point about, we don't think about conversations as productive to our work necessarily, or at least these kinds of conversations. We think about the critique as a conversation that somehow moves work forward, but we don't think about just us talking about something as being as important as, if it's a written project, going through drafts, if it's a design project, going through the various iterations. But we should, because these conversations, to Karen's point, I haven't really articulated that yet. But the moment someone says, hey, talk about this, you start putting those ideas together. And it's exactly what we tell our students too. I always jokingly say, you need to say this out loud.
Yeah.
They're actually going to hear it.
Well, I mean, I think these conversations are happening, but they're not public, and people are not privy to the reality that, man, like, before I come up with something brilliant, I'm having like 20 different clunky conversations about that idea,
right?
With my close friends, colleagues, collaborators, what have you. You said earlier that we have been asking the same question of a bunch of different people, and now I want to ask you this question. I want to ask you the question that we have been asking.
Oh no!
Yes. So you're now going to have to answer our school of thought question.
Okay,
Gabrielle,
but I'm going to keep an eye on the clock, because you have to answer it too.
Okay. All right. I will put a time limit of 5 minutes on it.
Okay. So please ask the question.
Okay,
Let's do this in an official capacity.
The question. Gabrielle Esperdy at Universal Lunch. We're interested not just in the work that you're producing, your fabulous books, your ideas, but also in the ideas that feed that work. We want to trace a line backwards through your career and your education and try to unpack formative experiences, institutions, or people who shaped what we might call your particular school of thought. What can you tell us, Gabrielle, about how your particular perspective as a designer and a writer was formed?
It was interesting to me that Karen, I can't go back to crawling at 9 months.
I know, that's amazing that she could.
But I do think that there are these that moments in childhood that you realize later were formative. And this is going to sound like the craziest example, but it's something that has stuck with me for so many years, which was in the 70s, being at a grocery store, like a suburban grocery store in Cincinnati, Ohio. So somewhere physically within the city limits, but a detached grocery store that had a front entrance and a back entrance. And the front entrance was the pedestrian entrance. But we always used to drive there, so we would go in the back entrance, which what I remember very clearly, and I now understand that is a very typical way in which older commercial strips adapted themselves to the automobile. So, but we'd go in this back entrance, and the things I remember about the back entrance were that it was not nice, right? It was kind of grungy. I also remember that there was a ramp. Okay, so the ramp was super cool because you'd walk through the store, and then you got to go down this ramp on the way out. So the thrill of taking a grocery cart and going down a ramp to this lower level where your car was, it left such an impression. And then when I think about it again, I'm like, well, what was it that really made that impression? Well, it was clearly about being situated in space, recognizing that, like, this everyday thing that we did, which was going grocery shopping with my mother, like that somebody had been thinking about that. Someone had been thinking about how I was going to go to a grocery store and interact with it. And then the other thing that gets layered on top of that is that it so happened in the early 70s in Cincinnati, Ohio, that parking lot of I guess it was a Kroger supermarket, that parking lot also had what we would now call a green market or a farm market, that farmers would come in from the agricultural hinterlands and would sell stuff out of the back of their trucks. And so I was also really conscious of that there was a kind of seemingly informal economy. And of course, I didn't call it that then, but like dudes in trucks, dudes in trucks selling stuff out of the back, and that was in a different kind of space than where we had just come from. So I think that when we moved to Cincinnati, Ohio, right, all things come back to the Midwest somehow. I was old enough to understand the place that I was living. I was still really young, right? I was like, I started kindergarten there. Old enough in the sense of you're seeing the world around you and you are cataloging it. And so I remember those experiences because I also remember I was really interested in cataloging that stuff. Like I was interested in the fact that we pushed a shopping cart, like a grocery cart, and what that meant. I was interested in like the kind of car that we drove, not in a consumerist way, but like, why is the car this color? Why does it have a stick shift? Starting that dawning awareness of our relationship to objects and our relationship to spaces, that again, in a very particular way, I also became aware of where our house was in relationship to the larger neighborhood, in relationship to downtown, in relationship to the Ohio River, and kind of the weird landscape where you traversed from residential and commercial to former industrial to the railroad tracks to the river, because of course we weren't supposed to, but we used to go there all the time and like would walk down to the river through what I now understand were industrial ruins. So those things were like those were childhood experiences that I realized were absolutely formative to the kinds of things I'm interested in. And then, you get to high school, that interest remains. I go to college, I study art history and take design classes, take architecture classes, but within an art department that was architecture, art, and art history. And then and still thinking through all of those things and realizing that I was really, really interested in the world around me in a literal way, like in the everyday environment. And that just kind of remained. And then when I got to graduate school, I had the singular good luck of having a professor and a PhD advisor. Actually, I'm having dinner with her tonight, who recognized that like there was value in looking at all that other stuff, and that she was then working on the work of Denise Gutbrand and Robert Venturi, and started talking about the view from the parking lot. And not just as a way of designing, but also as a way of looking at the history of design. And that was a way of validating something I had always been interested in. And then if I jump forward, so that's that kind of like engagement with the everyday, and seeing that as a kind of intellectual proposition. And then jumping forward, the last thing was, you're in graduate school, you gotta pay the rent somehow. And teaching as an adjunct is what you do. And I had the singular good fortune to have my first adjunct gig be in the School of Architecture at Pratt Institute. And so from the moment I started teaching, I was teaching in a School of Architecture, which clearly had a critical way on the way I've continued to think about my own work as a scholar and as a writer and a critic, that it's kind of enmeshed with contemporary practice, even though my work is largely scholarly.
How did you find your way? How did all of these interests manifest itself as history, as a scholarship, as writing? Yeah, how did that path happen for you? Like to manifest these interests in that way versus in building?
When I was in college, I enjoyed my studio classes, but I realized I was always much more interested in unpacking the problem than I was specifically in and thinking about the problem. I was listening to a podcast and they were talking about a thought experiment, almost doing those things as thought experiments rather than caring about their actual resolution. And I think that was a really important moment when I thought, okay, I can just actually be the critic. And so a critic unpacks things, thinks about the way that, I mean, I know you know what a critic is, but then I put that into an historical context. And so, because it seems to me always that the critical issue and what's always missing in contemporary design is the broader, let's call it the chronological context. As if I was just saying to my students the other day, y'all need to stop acting like you're reinventing the wheel every time. You are not reinventing the wheel. Trust me.
Yeah.
Someone has already
the
thought
knowledge
of this. Yeah. You need to go back to that thing and figure out what works and what doesn't work. So I think that's that kind of, I was always interested in, let's call it the project of history. And then starting to always teaching in design schools made one of my agendas became making sure that the historical project is always a part of contemporary discourse. And that's where, and there you have it. And then I end up at a place like NJIT, in which technology, never imagining I'd end up at a tech school, but that becomes really, really interesting. You realize that your situation informs who you are. So I then became really interested in notions of digital humanities and digital representation, and in a way that I never could have imagined that would have had that impact. And also, again, being in New Jersey, which is a radically understudied landscape. And having grown up in Philadelphia and then moved to New York, it literally was always the in-between place. And now bringing my own kind of interest to this again, I like the idea of radically understudied because it means it's woefully misunderstood. And there's so much richness here, both in a positive way, like formally rich, but also in a like family friendly, but in a fucked up way. What have we done? What have humans done? And therefore, it's that important to study. So that's my long-winded answer. Your turn.
Okay, ask me the question.
Yes. So Jimmy, here at Universal Lunch, we're interested, of course, we're interested in the work that you're producing, but we're also interested in the ideas that feed that work. So trace for us a line backwards through your career in education, unpacking those formative experiences, institutions, or people who shaped what might be called your particular school of thought.
Okay. So it didn't really occur to me till recently that I think I grew up around people who had a really strong impulse for making things. And I think that's why that impulse is so strong and embedded into my person, is that, my family they're refugees from Vietnam, who were left Vietnam, way after the fall of Saigon. They were in the wave of boat people. So they lived in refugee camps, and finally made their way to America in like the early 80s, so like 1980. And I was their firstborn child in America. And so we grew up, we were not rich. We were definitely poor, working class. And so both of my parents were, always working. And so my grandmother, my dad's mom, raised me. And she was so crafty. We were always cooking. I was always around cooking, and I was always around sewing. And I was around a lot of women who were great craftspeople, I think. And so I grew up around that, and it never really occurred to me how much that has imprinted into my being, like the impulse to always be making something, and to try to figure out how things are constructed, how they're made, and what they might mean. And I think, but I was taught growing up to fight that impulse. Like don't be an artist. please be something useful,
Uh,
like like a lawyer or a
yes.
doctor, but probably more like a dentist or an optician, and something more practical and achievable, like dentistry. And so I went to school for advertising, which I thought was the most practical thing, in terms of applied creativity or whatever, and it was miserable for me. And I just never got into it. I was it was like studying things like strategy and like the market and things like that, which I was fine at. I was competent at it, but it brought me no joy. And my last semester of my senior year in college, I had a crazy friend who was like, you should take this weird class. It's something called a studio, and it's in the film department. And I was like, you know what? I'll do anything at this point. and up until that point, I had no idea what art school was. I had no idea what a studio environment was like. And the course was taught by this professor with an art history background, an architecture master's, and her name is Samantha Krukowski, who I think she teaches in Ohio now, I believe. But anyway, the class was crazy. It was taught at a time where people were interested in convergent media, in things like that, and it blew my fucking mind. And I had a taste of the studio environment, and I think that's when I knew that I was like, okay, I think I want to do this instead, but I didn't know what that looked like. And so I had to graduate, and then I went to grad school. I lucked out in grad school. I had no idea what design was when I applied to grad school. I had no idea. I just knew that I wanted to make stuff, and I think in grad school, I think that's where I came to education. I think I came to education as a way of challenging the field. And I was really interested in the idea of graphic design in the expanded field. So graphic design beyond commercial application, graphic design, with other disciplines. And I think I just fell into education as a way of making that expanded field real. I thought that I didn't know. I didn't feel confident about doing that through practice, and I felt like I had more to say in the classroom. And then I started teaching at the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign. I don't really know how I got hired there. I mean, it must have been some kind of
out in the prairie.
Yeah, I mean, I really don't. I was 25, 26. I don't know. I mean, that was like the lion's den getting tossed into. I mean, that was real. That school was real. And then I spent 5 years there, didn't get tenure, because honestly, didn't deserve it. I didn't know what it was. I didn't know what that whole process was. I was, and then I ended up here at a teaching school, a liberal arts teaching school, where I think it has fundamentally changed me as a person who teaches. Like, it's made me up my game in the classroom, because that's you have to be good here. You can't not be a good teacher here.
But I want to go back to something. We all have a tendency to describe our trajectories and use terms like ended up. But you also, as you were talking about being in graduate school, and where was that again? That was
University of Texas.
Oh, no. University of Texas. So and that's UT Austin?
Uh-huh.
Yeah. So at UT Austin, you used a phrase that was something like being in graduate school. You came to education as a way of changing, right? As a way of changing graphic design in an expanded field. So it's not an ended up. It's like that deliberate recognition that, maybe the academy is going to give me greater leeway to sort of challenge disciplinary expectations, frameworks, et cetera. And I think that's important to point out. And that then shifting from like a research university to a teaching school allows you to really focus on pedagogy and to say, because I think that's so exciting. Because pedagogy, I know pedagogy is one of those things that everybody yawns about, and yet we also tend to get really excited about it.
Yeah.
Because it's like, hey, a new course, a new program.
Yeah, I think that we've touched on this over the course of our universal lunch, is that, like, no one really teaches you how to teach, and you're expected to kind of just know. And I think here, over the past 7 years being here at a teaching school, I've really had to been required really to be introspective about my pedagogy and like who am I as an educator. I think I've really clarified that here.
I think that's so important, and you're absolutely right that we are not taught how to teach. And when I had to teach a pedagogy class for our PhD students, I thought, and actually kind of like teaching a methodology class, because I didn't do those in graduate school. We read a whole bunch of critical theory, but we didn't have a methods class because those were not fashionable anymore. And we sure as hell didn't have a pedagogy class. And so I think it was really interesting to kind of think through, in order to teach a pedagogy class, to go back to, in some ways, formative experiences.
Where do you get what's your pedagogical lineage? Like, where do you think, who has been most influential on your pedagogy?
Bell hooks.
Oh.
I read Teaching to Transgress. That book came out when I think I was far enough along in graduate school that I don't remember if I'd have to look at the dates. I don't remember if I'd already started teaching. But I mean, that was one of those things where I thought, oh, wow, it was a way of being simultaneously self-conscious about your pedagogy, but also critical about it. And even though when I read, so I think very clearly it was bell hooks, and also going to graduate school at a moment when I was in graduate school at the CUNY Graduate Center, City University of New York Grad Center, I took the very first course that was offered at what was the Center for Lesbian and Gay Studies. And first course that they had ever taught. It was, kind of crazy all over the place because it was the first one. But it was a moment when what we would now call queer theory was also beginning to inform the academy, and that whole notion of unpacking everything. So a kind of post-structuralist, applied post-structuralism. And I think in some ways, bell hooks made that operative and personal. And that there were ways in which you could bring recognize that your personal experience, as Karen was alluding to, right? Inevitably, we all are who we are, and we bring that into everything that we do. And I think that it's so valuable to recognize those experiences. So pedagogically, I think it was absolutely bell hooks. And then also, of course, the way my own intellectual interests mesh with that. How about you?
Well, for me, I was, educated by people who went to the GSD at Harvard, Chris Taylor, people who went to Yale and MIT, so Gloria Lee, and people who went to Cranbrook, David Shields, Dan Olson. And so I feel connected to those lineages of, pedagogy and thought. But yeah, like I think just experiences like going on, being a participant in Land Arts of the American West with Chris Taylor, going out in the field and thinking about that approach to pedagogy and the experience that changes you has really shaped my own outlook on like how design should be taught. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, it is interesting, right? Those experiences, that one experience can be so transformative, or
Yeah.
a series of experiences.
Right.
And I think
that's,
it is.
yeah, no, I was going to say, I think I want to connect it back to design inquiry as an experience that I think fundamentally changes people, right? That people who come can be transformed by that experience, and how does it begin to resonate out into the world in that way, I think is an amazing aspect of design inquiry.
Absolutely. And I know, again, on a personal level, it gave me a level of freedom that I knew I wanted, a kind of, let's say, a disciplinary freedom, a way of a creative freedom, but that again, we all need validation, right? So it validates.
Yes.
Oh, you mean I can do that? And then gives
permission too. Right?
Absolutely. And then in that giving permission enables you to make a case for why it's important. And also pedagogically, because I, came back from the very first design inquiry I ever went to and changed up a bunch of ways I had been doing assignments. And so there you go. It wraps it back round to design inquiry.
Yes. And now we're out of time.
Indeed, we are.
Universal Lunch will be on a pause.
Let's say that.
It's on a pause.
It's on a pause until we get someone to fund us.
Yeah, please, people with money on the internet.
Please, all you councils on the arts, Graham Foundation, are you listening? Because I do think we would certainly be able to make a legitimate claim that this has been our test case. Yeah. And that if we don't do it, hopefully the other thing we can do is inspire others to do this in a design context.
Yes.
It has been simultaneously a huge pain in the ass,
yes.
And simultaneously something I wouldn't trade for anything, because to have a weekly dialogue with you, to have a weekly conversation with our guests has been a pure joy. And as Thoreau said, surely joy is the condition of life. So
the Buddha says life is suffering.
There you have the difference between Protestants and Buddhists. Yeah. And as someone who was raised Catholic, not in between.
And on that note,
Jimmy, it has been such a pleasure. A shout out to Kelly Cree, our producer, who's been behind the scenes making this happen. And thanks again to Design Inquiry for giving us the opportunity to get this together, and to all of our guests, and Jimmy, especially to you as a co-host and collaborator and instigator.
It has been a fabulous time. This is our pause in Universal Lunch. I'm Jimmy Lou, signing off from Austin, Texas.
And I'm Gabrielle Esperty in Newark, New Jersey, signing off for now. And just remember, people, everything is a project.
Until we meet again.